Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. What I would like to try to do is I would like to try to give a bit of a more business impact and market impact perspective in terms of what we have seen as a result of the GDPR. I think it's fair to say that as we were getting close to the GDPR D-date, the 25th of May, we've seen a lot of hype. I remember going to events like InfoSecurity in London in 2017 and seeing, the whole place filled up with discussions about GDPR. I remember being asked to organize a session within the RSA conference in 2018 in San Francisco, an event that to a large degree has an American audience, and ending up with about 1,000 people in the room wanting to hear and discuss GDPR. So we have had a lot of attention around GDPR the past few weeks, months, probably even 2 years. I don't want to go into the, is it bad or is it good or, what do we think of it, but rather focus very much on the facts around the impact of GDPR. And certainly from my perspective and experience, having spent 5 years of my life in the GDPR negotiations, then another 2.5 years of my life in the face of, explaining what this is inside Symantec and working with the different teams inside Symantec on what our position needs to be. So I'd like to begin actually by pointing out to a couple of numbers that I think are very telling. According to the IDC, the analyst firm, software sales related to GDPR will get to 2.3 billion by 2017 and will reach 3.7 billion US dollars by 2019. Between 2016 and 2021, the average constant annual growth rate on sales and software, on software and services, is in the range of 20% year on year. So, conclusion number one, we can all agree that GDPR has been expensive, has costed money. There's no discussion about that when you see a growth of that size. We can also agree that there's been a business impact in the sense that a market has been created. And you see that very much in the way we see innovation, in the way we see companies offering compliance tools around GDPR, in the way we see services being offered around GDPR implementation, governance, data protection officers, law firms, consulting. So, and I will even go as far as to say that even when I look at the smaller and medium European companies that are focused on software delivery, implementation of solutions, they've been benefiting by being able to provide these kind of consulting and other services. So there's definitely a business impact. From my perspective, when I look at GDPR, I don't only see a consumer protection, I don't only see a human rights, a privacy protection legislation. And I stress that very much when I'm speaking to large organizations. I see a piece of legislation that regulates information governance, that regulates how organizations capture information from its birth all the way to its death, how they delete it, how they destroy it, how they no longer use it. What do they do if they lose them? How do they transfer them? So from my perspective, GDPR is definitely also about human rights and individual user protection, but it's much more around the governance model. And there we need to take a step and think a bit, what does this mean again from a technology and from a business processing standpoint? Because the way an average company would treat privacy would be looking at it as a strategic objective. This is what we need to do because it gives us competitive advantage. This is what we need to do because it positions us in the market. But at the same time, the operationalization, how do we make this work, is a combination of people, processes, and technologies. And frankly, very often, the technical controls will be security related. Why is that? Not only, not exclusively, but very often. Why is that? Ladies and gentlemen, If I leave my wallet here on the podium and walk away, at one point, all of you are very nice, I'm sure, but at one point someone is going to take it away and look at it. And I'm sure we can all agree that in my wallet there are valuable personal data, like my ID cards and my credit cards. My ability to keep this information private depends on my ability to deny access to that information. So, when it comes to the role of security technologies or technological controls, my ability to ensure the privacy depends on my ability to decide who gets to see the data or not. So I better put this back in my pocket. So, on that understanding, suddenly, because of the attention that GDPR got, GDPR became a board-level issue, became an issue that was to be discussed at the highest level. And linked to that, cybersecurity became part of that discussion, because when I look at GDPR in comparison, let's say, to 9546, in 9546 there was one article on cybersecurity, Article 17. In GDPR there were more than 10 articles on cybersecurity, including cybersecurity being a basic principle under GDPR. Whole chapter, rules around breach notice, and on and on and on. So when you have to comply with GDPR, it's not just about the security article, the security measures you need to have. It's not about the principle. It's not about the breach notice. It's also about the fact that you need to do general good governance. It's the fact that you have to have data mapping. You need to know what data you have. Where do they go? How long do you keep them? How do you manage your cloud? What do you need to do in case you need to deal with an incident? So all these properties result into the overall level of cybersecurity being raised as a result of the GDPR requirements, if applied properly. Now, predictably, companies would come and talk to me about 4 key areas: security, understandably, breach and breach notice, cloud, and then risk. How do we manage the overall risk? And look, depending on who you talk, you'll get different feedback. I think everyone will agree on the point I made about it being expensive, but at the same time, I think everyone will agree that it was also an opportunity, GDPR, to do a bit of spring cleanup, able to put new projects there that would improve the overall security posture that needed to be done, that in the end would give more flexibility to organizations to play around and use their data. And you could see that also in the different conversations around trying to understand, what does GDPR mean versus my obligations on how do I handle a breach? How quickly am I expected to do the detection? What does the 72 hours requirement mean? How am I expected to manage the fact that I'm having cloud operations, but at the same time, my users are bringing their own device, which I permit, and yet they're using also, their own cloud applications, which I don't control, and there's this mismatch of data exchange. So all of these are governance points, if you like, that GDPR one way or another addresses. There's no doubt in my mind that GDPR has had a global impact. And that is the case because I am responsible for Asia as well as Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And consequently, I'll go to Singapore, I'll go to Australia, I'll go to India, I'll go to Japan, I'll go to the Middle East, and I will get in all those places GDPR questions. I will be talking to people that want to understand what does GDPR means for them. So in that sense, GDPR has certainly been impactful. Key challenges that I see for the security space moving forward. Real-life guidance, realistic guidance from the data protection authorities and others to address the internal conflicts within GDPR is going to be strategic. There are internal tensions inside GDPR that require to be balanced. We're expected to protect the privacy of the employees. At the same time, we're expected to detect a breach when it happens in the workspace and be able to notify within 72 hours. How are we going to do that unless we're able to do a degree of balanced, justified monitoring? We need to be able to answer to some of these questions in an effective manner. GDPR is in force since the 25th of May, but has not been enforced yet. We don't have case law. And a lot will be determined on how we see the different data protection authorities applying this case law and the different guidance that we're going to get as a result of this implementation. Frankly, discussions like you just heard today about the whois are understandable, because these are the kind of examples of cases caught accidentally and in the middle of the crossfire. I don't think whois has a very valid business function from a technology standpoint, from a law enforcement standpoint, from a cybersecurity standpoint. We use the whois to understand whether a domain name is or is not legitimate. At the same time, there's also a valid privacy argument why it needs to be protected. So how do we get to that middle ground is the kind of childhood illnesses that we see with GDPR as well. From my perspective, when I look at the technology and industry challenge, the big challenge is not going to be just the compliance. We'll get to the regulatory compliance eventually, at least those that haven't gotten already. We feel that there's significant effort in the market to get to a good point. However, I think that the bigger challenge is going to be how we as industry are able to bridge other regulatory requirements, say GDPR cybersecurity with NIS cybersecurity requirements, GDPR breach notice with NIS breach notice, the Cybersecurity Act and the certification requirements that will come with it, but even more so, how we are going to be able to empower the users, the consumers, now that they have this very good, very powerful, from their perspective, regulatory framework. How will we be able to empower them with the tools for them to be able to protect their own privacy seamlessly and effectively, and understand what that means in a practical way? If you ask the average consumer, what is privacy? He will not necessarily understand what is his privacy on the internet, but he would be keen to actually make sure that he can protect it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and happy to take any questions.